Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This reading was produced using Natural Reader 14, a product of Natural Soft Limited. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Part 1. God is Technology. How the singularity of monotheism transcended biology and primed the technological genesis of God. The genesis of God. Between Auschwitz and the singularity. Irreducibly, maddeningly, the Jewish condition embodies what modern physics calls a singularity, a construct, or happening outside the norms, extraterritorial to probability and the findings of common reason. Judaism pulses and radiates energy like some black hole in the historical galaxy. George Steiner. Many of the followers of the Hasidic Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, d. 1994, believed that he was the Messiah. He left the following controversial statement, a possible theological explanation, for Hitler's destruction of most of European Jewry. Although the human mind may not be able to grasp this, there is a possibility that a physical catastrophe, he uses the term show, which means catastrophe, may be a spiritual benefaction because the bounds of the body and the soul are not necessarily coterminous. Body and soul have contradictory characteristics. What is good for the body may not be good for the soul. The Nazi genocide may have destroyed the bodies of Jews for the sake of saving their souls. This attempt at explanation is built upon a fundamental insight: body and soul have contradictory characteristics. In the Tanya, the classic work of Hasidic mystic spiritualism, Rabbi Shneur Zalman wrote, "The foundation and root of the entire Torah is to raise and exalt the soul over the body. The complete tzaddik, righteous person, is one who has transformed his animal soul completely towards connection with God." This is not a total repudiation of materialism, but rather, the transformation of material nature towards the higher end of God. The mitzvot, for example, are physical deeds done with physical objects such as tefillin that are the means of actualizing the divine in this world. Tefillin are parchments of scrolls inscribed with biblical verses encased in two black boxes that are strapped onto a Jew's forehead and arm during morning prayer. They may be the greatest literal, physical expression of the gene mem symbiosis of Judaism, wherein the words of the Bible are physically bound directly to the Jewish body. The gene mem mergence of flesh and tefillin is comparable to the man-machine mergence that is a cyborg. Both are the integral, spiritual mergence of human biology with superlative products of its own invention. Traditional Judaism represents a compromise between genes and memes that nonetheless points to the superiority of superbiology. The time is coming, however, when this traditional centrist position will no longer hold. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all point towards the total victory of the superbiological over the biological that is evolutionarily identical with the technological genesis of God. But because biology's cause is literally ingrained in human nature, the struggle between biology and post-biology implies struggle both within and among people. Auschwitz forces a re-evaluate of which is more important, genes or memes, genetic life or post-genetic life, biology or technology, the possibility of hell or the possibility of heaven. The two ultimate solutions to the Jewish problem, Auschwitz and the singularity, are really two solutions to the human problem. The choice between Auschwitz and the singularity is the choice between the reassertion of biological autoevolution and transcending biological evolution through technology. The choice between Auschwitz and the singularity can be reformulated in the question of the difference between Nazism and Zionism. Are Nazism and Zionism really different forms of the same human game? Hitler claimed that Jews are fundamentally a biological race. While Jews might use different means in their struggle for biological existence in accordance with their distinctive racial character, are the ultimate Jewish ends the same? Is the ultimate end of Judaism the biological survival of the Jews? If so, this implies that God is a slave to Jewish genes. Perhaps Jews prefer God to polytheism in accordance with their own ethnic character, but the difference would only be tactical, not strategic. This would mean that God served as a practical means for the end of Jewish genes, and this can explain the phenomenon of Judaism. In more secular terms, this would mean that the Jewish political left would only be the practical means for the Jewish right. But perhaps the reverse is true. Have the God memes that constitute Jewish law, custom, and belief exploited Jewish genes as a means of propagating themselves? 83 Just as the seeds of wheat planted by a farmer are exploiting the farmer to serve its own self-reproductive ends, Jewish memes may be exploiting Jewish genes. Have Jews been slaves to their own biology or slaves to God? The inescapability of the Jewish gene/meme conflict was rooted in the Jewish kinship paradox. Jewish genes, left to themselves, led to anarchic social conflict. Since Jewish socio-biological naturalism led to socially maladaptive behavior as a group, the survival of Jewish genes necessitated the survival of Jewish memes. This is why Judaism appears to be rooted in a kind of rebellion against biology. Whereas individual organisms originally evolved as a means of the replication of genes, the content of Jewish memes conflicted with gene supremacism. Jewish memes valued individual humans as ends in themselves. So while extreme Jewish genetic naturalism was genetic suicide, the extreme valuation of individuals as ends in themselves was also genetic suicide because it meant individuals completely unsubordinated to the propagation of their own genes. The original Jewish gene/meme symbiosis was always precarious because the logical extreme of gene propagation conflicts with the logical extreme of meme propagation. Traditional Judaism worked by compromising both extremes. The genes and memes of Judaism evolved towards opposite and incompatible extremes. The rule of the genes tends to increase social differentiation on the basis of sex and caste because these tend to be the most efficient divisions of labor from the standpoint of kin-selective gene propagation. The rule of the memes tends to decrease social differentiation on the basis of sex and caste on a basis of social egalitarianism because the egalitarian memes themselves cannot propagate themselves if totally subordinated to the total rule of the genes. Jewish genes and Jewish memes are thus in ultimate deadly competition for development. Jewish ethical egalitarian memes, taken to their logical extreme, lead to biological irrationalism and genetic suicide. Total altruism, for example, would amount to rational biological self-destruction. Radical ethical memes lead towards internationalism, and this negates the gene extreme of nationalism. Jewish egalitarian morality, taken to its extreme, demands that Jews choose themselves as an unchosen people. Zionism expresses the limits of what the Jewish national idea can strive for as a traditional state, not world dominion, but a secure existence, a territorial limited promised land. Compared with other nationalisms, Zionism is an inherently limited political concept because a Jew's allegiance to his own nation to a Jew's own genes is both interwoven and limited by Judaism's distinct ethical meme tradition. Despite all of its existential moral compromises, Zionism is a political concept that limits itself. When I say it is limited, I mean that is biologically limited in the fullest eugenic sense. A maximal political biological strategy implies, not only territorial expansion, but also eugenic self-development, a biological logic realized by the Nazi regime. Ultimately, this maximization must be understood in its most radical sense: politics as evolutionary self-control, politics as biological self-determination. The Nazis took responsibility for the course of human biological evolution. Jewish values tend to restrain extreme human inequality and restrain biological self-control, control over who shall live and breed and who shall not. Nazi values seemingly ask, not only how to preserve inequality, but how to increase it, how to breed organisms with greater and more unequal biological bodies and abilities, how to breed a god. The deepest Jewish contrast with the Nazis, in this respect, is to be found in the Nazi willingness to sterilize and select members of their own people for eugenic purposes, and risk all of their lives in wars of conquest beyond what is necessary to secure a territorially delimited national state. The Jewish valuation of every individual life precludes the extreme socio-biological apoptosis of Nazi racial sculpting. Jewish concern for the most basic premises of human biological existence precludes this entire path of active, overt control over biological evolution through artificial selection. Antisemitism, moreover, is a precarious impetus to national unity. Taken to its extreme, this source of Jewish national unity can become the source of Jewish national extinction. Jews have survived by riding the fine line between extermination and existence, and it was the biological radicalism of the Nazis that propelled them over the exterminationist line. If the Nazi Judeocide was a logical implication of radical Jewish nationalism in the sense that the organizing force of anti-Semitism has kept the Jewish people together, then this in itself illustrates why the Jews represents a dead end of biological evolution. The superlative possibilities of biological evolution are limited for Jews, and a root of this limit is the Jewish kinship paradox. Conscience effectively grants veto power over higher levels of political kin-selective development. Incapable of unqualified duty to political nationalism, Jews evolved strong tendencies towards internationalism. Judaism's rebellion against the specifically biological logic that culminates in a Nazi-like Überorganism is precisely what led to the idea of God as the alternative, post-biological extreme. Incapable of forming the biologically based social synthesis of a unified national state and abused by those who could, the biological extreme became identified with evil in Judaism. The Jewish ethical idea, taken to its most radical extreme, implicates the total breakdown of biological values through the total negation of all biological hierarchy. From a purely biological perspective, radical Judaism leads to a program of biological self-destruction. If the only genuine source of Jewish values are human, and Jewish rejection of the values of powerful Gentile nations are only the product of a reaction to those powerful nations that oppress Jews, then Jewish values are only the inversion of the values of the master. If so, then Jewish values are tendentious, partial, and distinctly non-universal. Jews inverted the biological values of Gentiles, but to be ethically consistent, Jews must invert the values that preserve themselves as biological beings. For Jews to consistently apply these moral values to themselves, and invert their own biologically preserving values, would amount to Jewish biological self-destruction. This self-inversion is really the logical fulfillment of the inversion of biological values that Judaism began. The self-realization of the Jewish memes is the self-destruction of Jewish genes. Self-inversion is self-destruction. The self-consistency of the Jewish egalitarian meme implies separation from Jewish genes. In order to be consistent with itself, the Jewish ethical meme must free itself from its original slavish dependence on its parent, Jewish genes. Human genes are the master to be overthrown. From a purely biological perspective, Jewish self-destruction would be the ultimate Jewish self-realization. The Jews of history cannot escape being biological beings. Jews are both of and against biology, and this means self-conflict. While Jews have existed by compromising both the gene extreme and the meme extreme, God is the expression of the meme extreme that the Jewish way points. Because Jewish genes and Jewish memes are in conflict with one another, and Judaism is premised upon the disavowal of the biological extreme, Jewish history finds its completion in the realization of the post-biological/meme extreme of the singularity. The completion of the Jewish idea is total liberation from biology. The logic of Jewish history points to a revolution in which post-biological evolution overthrows the genetic evolution that gave birth to it. This would be the completion of the anti-genetic, anti-biological logic that Judaism began. Nazism was a revolt of the genes. If the Nazis were right, and biology is the ultimate destiny of the human race, then the Judeocide will likely happen again. If one is fundamentally opposed to direction of history leading to the singularity, then one could conclude that Auschwitz was good and that the genocide of the Jews was right. Jews stand guilty before the entire human race of bringing the superlative biological interests of evolution to ruin. However, if one recognizes the larger evolution perspective beyond biological evolution, then precisely the opposite is true. Biology first movements such as Nazism stand guilty of bringing the larger evolutionary interests of life on Earth to ruin. Either one must recognize the biological genius of Auschwitz, or one must will a form of post-biological genius, excellence, and virtue so qualitatively superior that it will merit the expectations of the singularity. It is no accident that these two extremes, Auschwitz and the singularity, stand opposed to one another beyond all normal laws of human history. While the hell of Auschwitz represents the revival of the Darwinian principle of death without redemption, the singularity is the potential for a qualitative difference in the survival of all humans in the heaven of post-biological life. If there is a delusion here, it is not in the technological possibility of a digital heaven, but in the belief that it will necessarily happen even if humans remain passive, morally indifferent, and unwilling to take control over the future in a way that benefits all life. The Nazi destruction of European Jewry happened because the presence of God in the world was weak. The God that presided over Auschwitz was a weak God because God did not yet exist. A genocide will likely happen again unless God is made strong.